Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, Episode 5. I'd like to begin with a letter that I received from an individual who I responded to last week's episode about adult addiction. So the next day, I received the following letter. I listened closely to last episode, how you explained the soul's challenge and the Tanya's way of dealing with self-control, addressing my deeply troubling question. The way you addressed it with such care and empathy, and with the insights from Tanya, touched me deeply. When you cited the need to sometimes cry over the soul's descent, citing chapter 45 in Tanya, I actually began to weep almost uncontrollably. And you know what? That night was one of my most peaceful in many years. And without even mentioning it, obviously, I was able to stay away from my addiction. I now have my work cut out for me to keep up this vigilance, but I feel that I have renewed strength. Thank you from the depths of my heart. I read it because I felt getting feedback from the things we're discussing is obviously the most important, because the bottom line is, as they say, the bechein, that there actually has to help. Chassidus isn't just theory, it isn't just ideas and abstract, it isn't just platitudes, about actually empowering each of us. So I was extremely moved by this letter. I just want to welcome and invite anyone that's hearing anything, that if you have any thoughts or you find ways that you've applied it, please contact us. And you can do this anonymously, confidentially, just like you're asking questions. It would be great to see how and if this is actually being applied and how it's being applied. The more feedback, the more we all learn from it. So thank you for that comment and all the other letters that have been coming in, and they keep on pouring in, I must say. I also want to mention that though I don't read all the questions, I do respond to a number of them that are not actually read. I respond to them even though without mentioning them by name or the actual quote. So please bear that in mind as well. Some of you have asked me this question. So now let us enter into session 5, episode 5. I again mention that viewer discretion is advised, especially for certain sections, which I will, when I get to them, I will mention that again, because of the adult nature of the topic and the sensitive nature. Though I shall speak about it hopefully in the way that the Rebbe taught us, which is in a tzniusdik way, modestly, and with the right innuendos, but at the same time necessary enough that's necessary for us to understand what we're talking about. So as follow-up to last week's discussion, I received a number of questions that stated the following. Okay, you've talked about issues that where people are crying out or reaching out for help. What about a situation where the person who has a problem is not reaching for help and doesn't even think there's a problem? And I've got in different categories this question applied itself in matters of personal life, in matters of relationships, but especially in shalom bayis. One questioner asked the following: how do I reach out to a person with a serious problem who's not calling out for help? I'm married and have a lot of shalom bayis issues. Money, jobs, intimacy, having kids, chinuch, parenting, making time for each other. Mashpiyim, rabbanim, and therapists never helped us much. And it doesn't seem like I'm able to reach to my spouse. Now I wonder what the spouse feels, whether she feels the same about her husband. Actually, I shouldn't even say she, he, because there is no she here, so I'm not really sure whether this is a man or a woman. But either way, it'd be interesting to hear what your spouse has to say if she or he feels the same way about you being open. Now, this question has been repeated a number of times, and it's a real issue. You may recall a few sessions back we spoke about narcissism, where someone is narcissistic. Narcissism, one of the key problems with narcissism is that no narcissist recognizes that they're a narcissist. Even though I can't say that exclusively. There's definitely situations that the case is not that way, but in many cases it's not. So let's talk about what Torah Chassidus says about reaching to someone that doesn't seem to be reachable. So first of all, let's start with a rule. We don't know who we're reaching or not reaching. You could be knocking on a door, and you may think nothing is happening, but in truth, a door is opening up. It may not even be now. It may be a seed that's planted that later opens up a door. The Shalom, for example, writes about prayer, about tefillah, when we pray. Why is it when Hashem, who's always awake and always hearing our prayers, why is it that some prayers seem not to be fulfilled? And he says it's like knocking on doors. You may have opened up 5 doors, but there's another 20 doors to open. And we know the stories with Alter Rebbe and other stories. Chazaki hi shetamula, chazaki she'ener chezeres reikom. A klal, a rule the Rebbe brings in many letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe and from the other Rebbeim, that an effort, when you make an effort, it's a chazaka, it's guaranteed that it will have some impact. So let's first state that for the record. There's no such thing as hopeless. Every person can be reached. Sometimes we're zeiche, we merit to see how the person is reached, and sometimes we don't see it immediately. Sometimes you hear years later, someone tells you, I remember what you told me years ago. So we should never think that our words go to vain. Now, even consciously, that person may not hear what you're saying, but being based on the fundamental belief that a neshama is always awake. Ani yeshena v'li be'er. I may be asleep, my heart is awake. That means somewhere they may hear something. You know, we all know the Gemara in Nida that talks about Malamdim, that they teach a child in its mother's womb the entire Torah, and then we're made to forget. The angel comes and zash, which is why some say we have a cleft over our lip. So the Alter Rebbe writes in the Likutei Torah, asks the question in the Likutei Torah Shlach, what's the purpose of teaching the entire Torah and then making us forget? As a matter of fact, there's halacha, there's a law that says you're not allowed to forget what you've learned. And the answer is we're only made to forget on a conscious level. The Torah is embedded within us. Perhaps it can be connected with the beginning of Tanya, also from Masechta Nida. Mashbir Neisei Tehi Tzadik Al Tehi Rasha. These things remain in our consciousness, perhaps in our unconsciousness, but they're there, embedded within us. And when we hear something that resonates, it's like saying, a truth I once heard, but I can't remember place it quite where. Which means we don't come as a clean slate. So when you say something to someone that seems unreachable, you may be sparking something there, and it may take time till it begins to be activated. It's called delay reaction. In Tafshin Chav Zayin, the Tetzaveh, the Rebbe spoke about the first shluchim that went to Australia, Bochrim. So he said then a mimer about sfichim. Sfichim are certain vegetation that you plant them, but they begin to grow later. So there's all kinds of questions about meiser and truma and bekurim and other things, what the rule is, what the law is concerning these plants that are planted now, but they may begin to sprout in a year or two from now. And the Rebbe used it as an example for when the Mittler Rebbe sent some of his chassidim to Israel, to Hebron, including his own daughter, Menucha Rachel and others. So some of the chassidim didn't want to go. Why didn't they want to go? Not because they didn't want to go on shlichus, they didn't want to miss the memorim of the Mittler Rebbe. So the Mittler Rebbe promised them that he would send them his ksavim, his manuscripts, which is why many of the Mittler Rebbe's memorim, original manuscripts, are found now today in Hebrew University and so on. Many of them made their way to the Rebbe's library, Agudas Chabad library, but there are many there because he sent them there. So the Rebbe asked a question in that Fabring in Tetzaveh Tov Chav Zayin. How does that help? They want to be with the Rebbe. They want to say, it's one thing reading a mimer in a manuscript, another is seeing the Rebbe say it. So how did the Mittler Rebbe Bavarin, how did he deal with that? How did he qualify that? And clearly the Chassidim went. That means it satisfied them. So the Rebbe said it's an example like Sfichim that has a delay reaction. That the Maimor, Manon Nafshik Sovis Yahavis, a Rebbe puts himself in the Maimer, and even though they are now physically not in his presence, when they see the Maimer, it reactivates that experience when they did see the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said the same thing as today with the Bochum going to Australia. He said, because they saw the Rebbe here, so even though they go, it has an impact, just as an example. Now, that's one point. So there's no such thing as unreachable. You may not see it, and someone could argue, well, how does it help me that my spouse, I may be saying something, planting a seed, and it doesn't affect them, doesn't help our home, doesn't help our lives. So let's mention a few other things. We all know, and I hesitate mentioning this, but we always have to mention it, hitting rock bottom is an expression. That sometimes the only thing that works, that shakes somebody out of their reverie, out of their complacency, is hitting rock bottom, where things really get terrible. But we don't have to wait for that. We can also contemplate what it is like hitting rock bottom. In other words, what I'm saying is a second thing to reach people, what motivates people who don't seem motivated, is sometimes shock treatment. Now, shock treatment, I'm not saying anything threatening or any ultimatums necessarily, but something that points out to them the consequences. Because like he says in Tanya, the reason many of us don't respond to a situation is because you think, it's not a big thing. We minimize the impact of a certain situation. So, point number 2 is motivation comes from meditating on that. In Torah Shalom, there's a very strong expression. The Rebbe Rashab writes there, says there, that he tells that life breaks all people. Better break yourself, because when God breaks someone, it may be not the way we like it, to put it mildly. So the bottom line is, when a person is completely complacent about their situation, something needs to be shaken. If it can be done with a positive type of kind words, by all means. If sometimes it requires a certain strong terms, but not judgmental, not obviously to turn somebody off or to close them down even further, sometimes that's necessary. The point is, we don't give up for someone we love. You keep knocking on the door. Now, obviously, it's always important to do things that are different, because you keep saying the same thing to someone that you can't reach. And I speak specifically about a spouse, because with a friend or someone that you can't reach, you do your best, and then you say to yourself, listen, maybe that's not my shlichus, is to wake that person up. God should wake him up. So someone else should wake him up. But when it comes to a situation where you have to do something because it's affecting you and your children or family and so on, so sometimes it's about coming up with a creative idea. Something kind, something different. But definitely one thing, do not maintain the same thing like, husbands talk about, they come home, their wives are always saying the same complaints to them. Or vice versa. A husband always saying the same complaint. That's the worst thing you can do. Because you stop registering. When you keep hearing something that sounds like a broken record, you stop registering it. So you have to find new ways. There's a letter from the Rebbe, more than one, in the Igros Kodesh where he talks about that. And says, find new words. Take your spouse, go on a trip. Do something different, and then often different things can evoke different reactions. Do the same thing, you're usually going to get the same reaction. Now, by no means is this a simple matter. I'm just giving some suggestions that are throughout Chassidus and through different letters and Yechidus and so on. And obviously, as always, I always qualify, case by case. It's always important to talk to a mashpia, to talk to someone that you can trust, a mentor, a rav, a friend, to be able to understand your situation. And most importantly, that you may be causing part of the problem. Not that blaming you, but it could be the way you react could just cement the situation and create even more obstinance and even more complications. There are definitely other ways to reach people, and again, it's about being persistent, if you really care, and doing whatever is possible. And remembering, the dvarim hayetzim min halev nichnasim al halev, words that come out of the heart enter the heart. Being that we're on this topic, I want to move to another topic which is far more sensitive, which deals with shalom bayis. And here I again repeat, viewer discretion advised. And this is about the issue of intimacy. And received many questions, but to sum up, I've chosen a few that reflect many others. I will modify a bit of the language to be not as explicit as it was written, but the message will get across. This is a husband writing. I feel my wife does not value appropriately the time intended for us to be together, including on the night, the mikveh immersion. But then later in the evening, we always something ends up happening, a headache, tired, or something else. It has happened more than once, and also on Shabbos and Yontif. How should I feel about this? What do I need to understand, and is there anything for me to do or say? What can or should we do together to improve our marriage? I commend the questioner being honest and open and not just blaming his wife, just seeing what he can do about the situation. Question the other way around. My husband is completely uninterested in being intimate with me, my wife is writing. Every night he gets into bed and falls asleep playing on his iPhone. I'm lonely and craving intimacy. We have been together only once in the last several months. I feel pathetic asking for it, especially when I'm often turned away with excuses that he's too tired or he's had a long day. It would be different if he just fell asleep, but he stays up until all hours of the night watching shtus on his cell phone. Shtus means nonsense for those that need a translation. Any advice on how to deal with this in an edel way? Edel means a refined way. Third questioner, I've been married for a few years. My husband is a wonderful person, a caring husband and father. However, I feel no physical attraction to him. And this obviously affects our intimate life and other aspects of our marriage. How can Chassidus help me improve this situation? And two more situations that I want to read. How does a person overcome fear of physical contact and deal with trust issues according to Chassidus? Or conversely, how does a person deal with someone who is fearful of intimacy? And then finally, someone writes that their husband seems to be avoiding intimacy due to Chassidishkeit, a form of precious, a form of abstinence. So we have here almost every scenario. I can't say every, there's obviously infinite scenarios, but a pretty good wide spectrum. Husband, wife, traction, fear, and frumkeit, religions. I want to begin with the last one, because I just saw a letter from the Rebbe, where a person is writing to the Rebbe that he is abstaining from being with his spouse because of, apparently from the letter it seems because of Chassidic reasons. It's skafi, it's called. Controlling oneself, not indulging in one's own pleasures. The Rebbe writes, and does not mince any words, in giving him a chelik, which means giving him over his head. The Rebbe writes that first of all, you have a shibud habal, you have an obligation as a husband to your wife. And secondly, and this is clearly to answer the Chassidus, he says, look in Megillah Esther, Tzadik Beis Seif Amadalit. Torah Megillah Esther, 92, the end of the fourth column. And then the Rebbe finishes, I'll tell you what it says there in a moment. Then the Rebbe finishes the letter and says, and al pizeh, and according to this, Bevada, you'll surely send me good news about your shalom bayis. What does he say in Torah? So it's all rather in-depth discussion, but the main thing that is important to mention there, and probably anyone who's learned Torah probably has missed it, until you see this letter from the Rebbe says there that the Alter Rebbe writes. The Alter Rebbe writes, Loi kedasa elam, not like the people who think, like the world thinks, that this thing is a dover mos. He's talking about intimacy. Is a dover mos, meaning a despicable thing, an ugly thing, an appropriate thing, because you have to go, there's a tefillah, there's going immersing in the mikveh, tefillas Ezra afterwards. It's not correct. The Alter Rebbe writes these words, Dover Godlhu, it's a great thing. And Dover Godlhu Lamaila, and it's a great thing above, meaning by Hashem. That's what the Rebbe writes. So I think it's a great launch pad to address all these questions, even though this addresses specifically someone that is trying to be mahadir. Yeah, don't indulge in pleasures that are not permitted, or pleasures that are not a mitzvah. The thing that's a mitzvah is a mitzvah. And though we live in a world where sexuality and intimacy has become contaminated because of the world, since the eating of the tree of knowledge, it's still, as we discussed last week about tznius, it's still Kodesh Kadoshim. In the right situation, it's the most sacred thing a person can do. It's the way we create life, and God sanctioned it and gave it great blessing. So the fact that we may have our negative thoughts has nothing to do with the mitzvah. It has nothing to do with what God wants of us. Work on finding a way to realize our intimacy is the holiest thing. Again, al pi halacha, in the right time, in the right way, and so on. Why do I mention it? Because I think, let's address it now in the context of the other questions that were asked. Again, the big qualification. Every case is case by case, and there's no way that I can give advice here online without even knowing who we're talking about specifically. But I want to use these questions, as I said, an opportunity to address the issue, and hopefully, if I'm able to convey some of the message that Chassidus talks about this, any couple dealing with these issues should go to a Rav, or go to a Mashpia, or go to someone they trust, and discuss it with them. But maybe this will help give some atheist, some words, that will give also courage to address it. part of Seder Ksusa Ve'nosa, which is the three obligations, which is food, shelter, food, not shelter, food, clothing, and intimacy, is part of the sacred bond between a husband and a wife. That's why Kedushin is in three ways, and one of them includes intimacy. So intimacy is not just to satisfy people's needs and pleasures. It's also part of the divine edict and the divine relationship. God created pleasure because it has divine pleasure. It's not a man-made creation, intimacy. We didn't come up with it. It wasn't some guy who invented this. This is the way God created the min. He created the human nature this way. And the way Judaism believes in it and looks at it as seeing as a divine relationship. So just like you have husband and wife have obligations to each other and a relationship with each other, intellectual communication. They have emotional relationship. They also have a physical relationship. As a matter of fact, despite the stereotype out there, the mitzvah of the union of a man and a woman, which comes back and unites the tzelem elikim of the male and the female, that were once one and then split into two, is in itself an objective. Then there's a mitzvah pruruvu that these two coming together should have children, which is why the Zohar brings in a number of places that when Avram and Sarah were together intimately, even though they did not have a child till many years later, Lamaila, above, a child was born, a soul was created. If you're Zeicha, that soul also comes down into a body. And Tzadikim and Tzidkonius, and in general, any man and woman who come together in Kedusha and sanctity, even after childbearing age, there's a sanctity to it. They create souls. However, they may not always merit that the soul should come down to a body. I don't want to elaborate more on this than necessary, but why am I saying it? That's because it's a critical component in marriage that there be an intimate relationship between a husband and wife. How often, and the details, that's already case by case, and there's many different halachas about it, and as well as customs, and that, again, everyone has to customize. But that there should be an open communication on that level is a critical component. And if it's missing, as Rabbanim, I heard once from Rabbi Zalman Shimon, and from other Rabbanim that says that usually if a marital crisis, it usually comes down to either something connected to intimacy or something connected to money. Obviously, there are exceptions, but this is pretty much a rule, and people don't talk about certain things. So it's a critical issue to address, obviously in a sensitive way. As I mentioned before, to criticize your partner is usually not going to work. They'll just dig in, and especially if there's some deeper reason, some resistance, they're definitely not going to respond by you criticizing or demanding. This requires a lot of gentleness and a lot of creativity. I'll give you an example. There was a couple who went to the Rebbe, and they were having an issue like this. And of all things the Rebbe mentioned, he spoke to the husband afterwards, privately. He asked to speak to the husband privately. The Rebbe asked him, what does something bother you about your wife? And the Rebbe suggested that maybe her breath, she has bad breath. And he said, yeah, that's where it began. He began to be repulsed. And he didn't want to bring it up. He doesn't want to insult her. Can you imagine? A small little thing like that. Or maybe it's not so small. Now, obviously, you could say maybe there's much more and he's just using that as an excuse. Maybe. But that can be a factor. And there are a lot of matters that husbands and wives don't want to speak to each other because of the sensitivity of the matter. They don't want to hurt each other. Or they have difficulty communicating. Many people have difficulty saying, I need something. I need intimacy now. I need to be hugged. I need to be nurtured in some way. This, of course, requires also some emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. And often in these situations, when two people cannot break through, it's almost inevitable that you must have a third party. At least individually, they should speak to someone and speak openly. So to now address these specific questions here, wife seemingly uninterested. Most likely, there's a reason for it. It could be what I just said, a certain repulsion, a certain feeling turned off by it. It could also be people have in their life experiences, negative sexual experiences that they don't talk about, whether it's molestation or other things that haunt them. So if there's a pattern that goes back a long way, usually from the beginning of the marriage, can sometimes be identified with that. I'm just reading through some usual suspects. And this could be a man or a woman. If, however, there was a close relationship and then something happened, yeah, unfortunately I don't want to mention this, but sometimes someone may be doing things that are inappropriate, and that's where they're releasing their energy, and therefore they're not that interested. Because the human nature is, obviously, both a man and a woman need each other. If they have another outlet, this is sometimes a sign of it. Now, I'm not trying to put any panic buttons and red alerts that that's a sign if someone doesn't want to be with their partner, that it means that. But we're trying to cover all the bases here. And the same thing the other way around. A husband that is staying up all night playing games and doesn't have a need for that, or doesn't have an interest, it could come down to something physical, it can come down to something emotional, it can come down to some just shame, some embarrassment. Some people feel as they get a little older, they can't, what they call, be completely there in the fullest possible way. The list goes on. One thing is clear, when it comes to the area of intimacy, inhibitions are many, and most are unspoken, and sometimes people themselves don't really know. Well, I believe that it's an obligation for each of us to address this, especially if it's affecting the rest of your marriage. If it's something that two partners can deal with, even then one has to wonder whether it's all healthy. But if it's affecting, it's an obligation like anything to address it, and the way to address it is to speak to someone that you can trust and address things sometimes bluntly and openly, obviously in a tznius way, which I've tried to do here. I hope I didn't offend anyone in this approach. But these are matters that are spoken about, and these are issues, so I felt I should address it. From a Chassidic point of view, a key point to always emphasize when it comes to relationships is the one big word, bittul. I know the word bittul has evoked in some people a very negative reaction, but I'm talking bittul out of strength. Bittul means that when people really care about something, they're ready to transcend themselves, and they transcend their needs. This doesn't mean your needs don't get met. It just means that a relationship doesn't begin and end with needs. Very often when I speak about relationships in the secular world, I always speak about compatibility. There's physical compatibility, there's emotional compatibility, there's intellectual compatibility. But there's one more that most people don't know about. It's called spiritual compatibility. Two people who've dedicated their life to build a home, to build a vision that's greater than the sum of the parts. That brings bittul into the picture. When you have only physical and emotional intellectual compatibility, which is great and should be there, but they are all mercurial. They change. People get older. Emotionally, you may not be that stimulated. Intellectually, you may be used to the partner. But spiritual compatibility is eternal. Binyan ad deyad. The eternity comes into the picture due to two people being able to transcend themselves. And the world of intimacy is part of that. The ability to be able to be vulnerable, in a way like the Rebbe brings, in a way where two people come together without any filters, without any veils, without any blocks. The whole world, everything we do in this world, has filters. Everyone has a face they wear when they go outside. You speak to this person, you put on this face. That person, a different face. We have our masks, we have our garments, we have layers and layers. In the language of Chassidus, we have levushim, parsois, mesachim, curtains, filters, layers, you name it. You have translucent ones, transparent ones, and so on. But when you're together with your spouse, two people coming one flesh, it means one flesh. Zocher nekeva, soulmates. This is an opportunity to actually reach a place that's deeper inside of you than you've ever reached. Does it take sometimes help? Yes. You may need someone to help direct you, because many of us are not trained to think that way, and we don't want to celebrate being vulnerable. Vulnerable is not easy. But celebrating vulnerability is the greatest strength we have. It's entering the Kodesh Kodashim, naked. And I mean that not in figurative, not just in a literal sense, but also in the figurative sense. Naked means pure, between you and God. In a sacred way, Kiddushin is exactly that. So therefore, this is an opportunity, intimacy is an opportunity, and the challenges that we face in that world, in that area, are an opportunity to come deeper and to connect it to yourself. Because it's about how you express yourself. And if you're able to express your innermost feelings, able to communicate it to another person, sometimes not even through words, through a look, through expression, through body language. This is the deepest way we connect to God. Because at the end of the day, Ish v'Isha is an example of physical mashal, metaphor for Knesset Yisrael and Kodesh B'richu, for a soul and Israel. Souls of Israel and God. Shir HaShirim, the Rambam writes, is a mashal, a metaphor for the divine and the human. Matan Torah was a chasna, Yom Chasanos is that Matan Torah. Mashiach, L'osad Lavi, is the Nesuyin. All in the language of marriage, all in the language of union. So the best way that God gave us an example, in our physical lives, connect to your spouse, you're connecting to me. So a person who has a difficulty in intimacy is having a difficulty relating to God too. Like the Alter Rebbe said, Dover Godlhu, not only Lamata, Lamayla. It's a Dover Godl, it's a great thing, because it's creating what's called in the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah and Chassidus, Yichud, a Yichud. This is the biggest Yichud possible. Though a mitzvah is also Yichud, Yichud Kudsha B'richa V'Shchinta, and the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, this Yichud is eternal. But the ultimate Yichud in the literal sense of it, husband and wife. And it creates a Yichud that ripples through all of existence, from the bottom all the way up to Lifnei Tzimtzum, all the way to the two sources for Ish v'Isha and their deepest root, which is the Eir Legalis and the Eir Legalis La'atzmei and the Eir Legalis Luzulase. So yes, Zachar and Nekeva are rooted in Zoh and Malchus. You know, we all know the joke, the Chassidus Applied, who never knew what a girl was and went on a date. And he comes running back and he says, she doesn't look at all like Malchus. He didn't look like Zoh either, I assume. So yes, it's rooted in Zoh and Malchus, Mashpia Makabel. It's rooted, the Zoh and Malchus are rooted in Kesed. They're rooted all the way before the Tzimtzum, and ultimately Kfuda Bas Melech Prima and Nekeva. The feminine energy is rooted in internal energy, and the masculine energy, Ish Darkei Lichbesh, is rooted in expressive energy. And you unite these two energies, which is the union of the whole point of Dira B'Tachtenim, connecting these two. So intimacy is an expression, which also leads us to another point. Intimacy is not only when husband and wife are physically together. It's 24/7. They can be apart. They don't have to be even in the same room, the same house, same country. But their souls are connected. But we cannot dismiss or disregard the physical element of it. Take it seriously is the most important thing. Take it seriously, and when there's a problem, do not just dismiss it. And if you can't reach your spouse, you have to find someone that perhaps can. And going back to the efforts that are necessary to motivate someone. And often with goodness, with the words from the heart, expressed directly, getting over shame, sometimes writing a note to your spouse, if you can't say it personally, and just evoke a love. Say how much you miss them. Find a way to express. And find a way to express it in a Chassidish way. Find a way to express it in an edler way, in a sensitive way. Because at the end of the day, despite what we experience in this world, this is the most sacred thing that human beings can do, and it's the most sacred way we connect with God. About building attraction, because of the time limitations, I will address some of these in a later stage. I just want to say, like it is with all things, when you apply yourself, you usually can build a lot more than you think you can build. If you just rely on your natural instincts as you are right now, obviously we're sometimes trapped in our own perceptions and so on. But we will talk about that some more. Now, since we're on this topic, I think it's important to mention a few things that are critical. In general, matters that are sensitive like this require, as I pointed out, a third party. This isn't, of course, my own words. The Rebbe himself, and I refer you to the Sichos of the Rebbe, Yutas Kislev Tavshin Lamed Zayin. The Rebbe began then a campaign called Mashpiim. Read the Sichos, and I believe that if we just follow that today, we'd have many of our issues resolved. He cites the Tanya, how the Alter Rebbe wanted that everybody should not prav any shifl shel sheker, people should not create some type of false measures of humility, but to reach out and offer their services to help others. I don't want to repeat all that said in those sikhs here. I'll repeat them as we go along in different episodes, but it's critical talks that the Rebbe gave. Yutas Kislev, he started Tavshin Lamed Zayin, the sikha before, the talk before we discussed Ayin Beis. And then he continued Rosh Chodesh Shvat and Tu B'Shvat and then Yud Shvat. A whole discussion what mashpia, and both for men and women mashpiyas. And the Rebbe, very fascinating. Shabbos Parsha Dvarim Tovshim Vov, the Rebbe instituted Aseh L'Charav. Again, it's a Mishnah, Aseh L'Charav, Knei L'Chachaver. The difference between Rav and Mashpia is something that needs to be discussed, but regardless, it's a very clear directive from the Rebbe about issues that covered both what we discussed, Sholem Bayis matters, and frankly, anything that requires an objective opinion, someone that's not biased, someone that has the seichel, the experience that can give us input. Now, just to add a little more, l'chvevusa de milsa, a little more flavor for this, there's a famous pasuk, and it's brought in Hayom Yom, Chav Hei Sivan, that there's im yidag odam yasiach. If a person has concerns, yasiach. The Gemara says two interpretations of the word yasiach. From the word hesach hadas, to distract yourself, and the second interpretation from the word sicha, to speak about it, lacherim. Yasichen o lacherim, to speak to others. The Tzemach Tzedek, he brings there in Hayom Yom, says yasichen o lacherim beguf. There are others, bodily others, but benefesh, they're really one and they completely feel for you. Famous question is this. It seems to be a contradiction between these two interpretations. Because the first interpretation says distract yourself. The second one says speak about it. When you speak, it's the opposite of distracting. Distracting means you stop thinking about it. Definitely not speak about it. So the Rebbe Marash, and the Frierdiker Rebbe brings it in a letter dated Chav Daled Nisan Tov Reish Ches Tzadik Ches. It's an Igros Kodesh of the Frierdiker Rebbe, volume 4, page 339. The Rebbe Marash gives a brilliant and simple answer, which is the basis of all therapy, actually. What he says there is that when you speak to someone else about it, and you speak in the proper way, you release it from yourself, and that person allows you to distract yourself from it. If you carry it within you, you get consumed by it. By speaking, you release it. Now, obviously, this is not always the case, even though he says this as a general rule. There's a famous question in Ranat. He says that sometimes when you are angry, you speak about it, you get angrier. Sometimes when we withhold it, you get angrier. So there's different circumstances. But this is a principle that's critical to understand the value of speaking with someone. The value of speaking with someone helps you release it. Because sometimes you get so angry and bottled up. These instances of intimacy, for example. You can imagine how angry someone gets when they're with their spouse and they're sitting and playing games all night instead of trying to be close to their spouse. So one of the ways is to express it, to find someone to express it, and that helps you also free yourself from it. And obviously the goal is to address it and solve the problem. Now Yidag Odam is not necessarily these issues. Yidag Odam is general concerns, anxieties, worries, stresses that people have. Okay, now let's go to another topic called conformity. The question was asked as follows. One topic I'd like to see addressed is Achrei Rabim Lahatas, which means following the consensus. On one hand, God gave each of us a unique mission in the world and abilities with which to carry it out. On the other hand, we live in a community and there's a mitzvah to conform to norms. But to what extent? How? Conflicts arise. Some chafe at the norms of certain communities and say they can't do their own thing. Because there's so much peer pressure and so much judgment and so many witch hunts, you can't do your own thing. Others in the community very much resent those who are doing their own thing. And if someone does do something, others resent it, especially when they're going against halach or accepted local minhag, custom. Question is, how do you balance these two? A similar question was asked about someone writes, a parent writes, my oldest son dropped out of the yeshiva here, wherever they live, citing that he feels traumatized, cannot handle being told what to do, and where he is 24/7. He felt all anyone cared about was whether he was on time, had his shirt tucked in, and whether he went to mikveh. No one asked him how he was doing, no one encouraged him, just badgered him and made him feel bad. He felt completely misunderstood at best and abused at worst, and that no one cared a whit about him. My son decided he had enough of these yeshivas, And he could see that they were all the same model and opted to go to another yeshiva that we do not approve of. But one that has a lot of flexibility, and my son has begun flourishing there. And I have very mixed feelings about how to deal with this son of mine. My question to you is this. What would the Rebbe say about all these boys? About half of my son's class from Cheder that are no longer in Lubavitch programs. Some are not in school at all anymore. What would the Rebbe say? Do all these boys have to be in the exact same model? Is it possible to have a yeshiva that deviates from the exact schedule they all have? Is it possible to find warmth rather than a demand that all boys' hats and shirts and shoes all be exactly the same? Okay. As you can see, I'm not shying away from some of the more controversial questions because they're actually coming in. So let's address this. I think this goes back to the topic, similar topic to what we discussed about Bittul and Kabbalah Sale, healthy and unhealthy. Someone who's beat up obviously finds it difficult to accept rules and guidelines, especially if they were used in an abusive way. So let's establish what the Torah says about individuality versus community. And here I refer you to a number of sikhs. There's in Chelik Chav Gimel 23, chapter in volume 23, a beautiful sikh of the Rebbe. Is it Chav Gimel or is it Yud Ches? I should say 18, I believe. Ba'alescha, with a beautiful sikh of the Rebbe, he talks about Yachid and Sibur, that we find in Judaism and focus sometimes on the individual, and sometimes we focus on the Sibur, on the community. So before getting into the personal and emotional aspects of it, what is the healthy view on individual versus vis-a-vis community? So a few key points. The Mishnah says, "Lefikach nivra adam yechidi," in Sanhedrin Lamed Zayin. Why was a person created as an individual, not as a group, not as a herd, like the other species? To teach him that chayav adam leimer, a person is responsible to say, "B'shvili nivra elam," the world was created because of me, not for arrogance but for responsibility, and that when you save one person, you save the entire world. By Matan Torah, what is the language? Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, asher yitzisicha meretz Mitzrayim, lo yilecha. So the Medrash asks, there were millions of people standing at Mount Sinai. Why is the Ten Commandments said in the singular? It should have said in the plural. Anoichi Hashem Elokechem, lo yilechem, kabed es avichem, lo ysignevu. Why does it say it in the singular? And the Medrash says, because every person standing there, in English, just to amplify the question, in English, when you say you can mean an individual, it can mean a group. In Hebrew, Aleichem is a group, Alecha or Alech is a singular, depending on masculine or feminine. So the Medrash answers, because every person standing there heard the Torah as an individual, as if no one else was there. Once heard Rabbi Sachs say, when he became first pulpit rabbi that he gave credit to the Rebbe who had encouraged him to become a rabbi, as is well known. After he gave his first Friday night speech, a woman came over to him, he tells the story, and asked him, "What you mentioned the Rebbe with such glowing terms. What's the difference between a Rebbe and a rabbi like you?" So he said, "You saw it here tonight. The difference is that a rabbi can speak to 500 people, and everybody thinks he's speaking to somebody else. A Rebbe speaks, he can speak to 5,000 people, and everyone thinks he's speaking to him or to her." So by Matan Torah, everyone heard as an individual. Lashon Yachid, emphasizing the individuality. And just look around. What are Jews if not fierce individualists? Individuality, b'shvili nivra elam. So the shaila becomes, so what is this thing called tzibur? What is the community? So we have a word, we call it synergy. Tzibur is synergy. The power of a vayakel Moshe. Hashem designated, Moshe designated that you should lahakel kehillas every Shabbos. The basis of a fabring, the basis of kehillas, communities. Because there's a synergy, a power that's more than the sum of the parts that comes together with individuals. But when we daven together, even in a minyan, you're still speaking individually to God. It's not a group prayer. There's a chazan for different reasons. You're speaking to God. But there's more power to your individual expression when you're doing it with a group. If the group eliminates or annihilates the individual, it's hepach haTorah. God created every individual. Ein deis ein shavos. Two people are not alike. Who created that? That's not man-made. Our job is to make sure that even though we have different opinions, we align our opinions to what the Torah wants, what God wants, what halacha wants. When there's a disagreement, there are rules how the Torah says how you deal with it, whether it's Acher Rabbim Lahati is the consensus, or halacha kihillel, and even then Shammai has to also follow the halacha. But we also have the concept Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, that even after the law, the ruling is one way, each has a virtue. So individuality is sacred. The challenge is, how do you balance individuality with the common good? So there are laws for this. The Rebbe has a fascinating reshima from the early years before the Nesias, where he talks about this issue. The focus on the individual, the focus on the group. He actually uses World War II as an example of the fascist regimes that annihilated the individual in the name of the common good, whether it was socialist or was national socialist, known as Mach Shemam, the Nazis. Whereas Torah, he brings the halacha that there are 1,000 people in a city, and God forbid an enemy comes and surrounds the city and says, give us one person, or we kill you all. What's the law? They don't mention a name. The law is you're not allowed to give one person. Just say 1 second. One person, 999 will be saved. Because the sanctity of one life, it's not quantitative, it's qualitative. So the individual is the most sacred thing. The fact that communities, some call them ghettos, or have a ghetto mentality and a narrow-minded mentality, that's due sometimes to people's discomfort, to their own insecurities. Has nothing to do necessarily with Torah. We have a Torah and halacha, which has to be followed, but within that context, there's plenty of room to think out of the box. As a matter of fact, the greatest Jews were out-of-the-box thinkers. What was Avram Avinu if he was not a nonconformist? He challenged the whole world. Avram Ivri on one side, the whole world on the other side. Mordechai, everybody bowed to Haman. If Mordechai was around today, people say, what's the big thing? Give a little bow to him. What do we need to incite him? Jews were never conformists. However, we're talking about it in the context of Torah and halacha. There's plenty of room for lafoshabah, like we say in Torah, to be mechadish in Torah based on the principles of Torah. So this is the key challenge. And I'll use musical notes as an example. Music, is it a conformist system or is it a free-spirited system? Most people say music, so free spirit. But you know, music has a structure. There are 8 musical notes on the scale. There are only that many keys on the piano. However, but you can play them in infinite combinations. So the rules of Torah are built in. That does not diminish the ability to say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Every time you say it, you should say it with a different passion, with a different intention that addresses the issues that you're dealing with. So it's not about repeating words, lip service, or just doing what everybody does. Yes, we all do Shabbos. Every Shabbos should be different. Chol Yom Yeh Beinecha Chadashim. We discussed this as well. Do it in a new way. Play the music in a new way. You could have 2 people play the same song, and for one it sounds ridiculous or very dead. Another person brings it alive. The same song. So the key here is, how do we find a balance? So first of all, we have to look at case by case. Obviously, you also want to be careful that someone doesn't just rebelliousness and allow them to just act on whatever they want to do, which sometimes gets them into trouble. Well, there are rules, whether you're in the army, or you're in business, or you're in college, or you are in yeshiva, there are rules, there's a discipline. But you also don't want to crush or quash the person's individuality. So my answer to the question is here, you have to look at your son, in this case, and find a way to give him an outlet. I don't think it has to necessarily leave the yeshiva system. Sometimes it's important to find the yeshiva system, complement it in some way. Obviously, if the schools were cooperating, we'd be even better off. But parents have to sometimes deal with a child if the school is not conducive to it. Our objective is to align ourselves with what the Torah wants of us, to be fierce individuals who are each in our own unique and indispensable way expressing what God wants of us. And every one of us has a unique and different mission than another person. How many times did the Rebbe say to Fabrengen, every person here has a role to play, an indispensable role to play, that no one that ever lived and no one that ever will live, not Moshe Rabbeinu, can live up and fulfill the role you have to play. Because God chose you for here and now, and that's extremely individualistic, and no way a contradiction to the tzibur, to the community. Because at the end of the day, every musical note needs to be played, and every note needs the others for the synergy, for them to work together. The sad question, of course, is how do we deal with this in a system or a community that may not be perfect and does put this pressure and does turn into witch hunts or lynch mobs or other things like this, very judgmental. Well, that is a whole other question which I will definitely address. Ultimately, the buck stops here. You have to start from yourself. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. I think if many of us begin to live up to the way the Torah expects of both an individual and a community, our communities become better. Because at the end of the day, we are probably all guilty at sometimes of judgmentalism and pointing fingers. And this requires introspection of changing that type of attitude. Okay. Let's move on. Next question. Since it's the month of Adar, the month of Simcha, how do you bring happiness into one's life? When a person is not in the mood of being happy, what do? It's a great question. It's almost a close cousin to the last week's discussion about the opposite of happiness, which is depression. And I want to begin with a letter from the Tzemach Tzedek that someone pointed out to me. Tzemach Tzedek writes a letter. It's printed in the Igros Kodesh, the letters of the Tzemach Tzedek. There's two versions of it there, where he talks about Simchas HaNefesh and getting rid of fears of pachad, which is in general just fear and fright and so on. I'm not going to read the whole letter. It's printed in as I said, the volume is the Tzemach Tzedek's letters. It's printed in page 325. That's the second version. It starts at 322 through 325. And he speaks there about the power that a person has to control their thoughts, to be positive thoughts. But then he goes on and says an expression, and he brings a whole case, builds a whole case, which I guess complements what it says in Tanya, that a person has the power to focus on positive things and therefore be in a positive mood. But then he goes on and says the following. That besides the fact that you have control over your thoughts, Iker Hesach Hadas, he says, the main way to distract yourself is to put your mind into other things that are positive. And then he adds, I'm reading now from inside, I'll just translate it. Also, a person shouldn't speak in negative ways. Even if you're in a bad mood, even moroshcheda, depressed mood, you should not speak in that way. Adrab, you should laharis ba'atzmei, you should put on even if it's fake, tenuas mesameches, movements that look happy, act happy. As if you are mole simcha believer, as you're filled with simcha, joy in your heart. Afal pi shein believer came b'shas ma'aseh, even though you don't feel it at the time. Seif Elias came. Ultimately, you'll become that way. And he brings a whole bunch of proofs. What he calls that levovis helach acher ha'pu'ulos. The heart follows a person's actions. And interesting that he quotes is that it's also hinted to, or not hinted to in the Zohar, but he brings a pardis of Ramesh Cordovero, the Sefer Pardis, Shar Hagvarim, the Gate of Colors, chapter 1, where he talks about colors. He says, we know that in the spiritual world there are no physical colors. And yet we associate colors down here with spiritual attributes. Chesed is connected to white, Gvura with red. And he says that when a person puts on a physical garment that's white, that helps them get into a mood of chesed. He actually brings a famous, I always thought it was a folklore, but actually he brings it here in the Pardes. He says this is why one of the eitzes, one of the solutions when a person is not well or is unable to sleep, they should think about water, running water. Because water elicits chesed, and chesed evokes a certain water within them and makes them tighter and allows them to sleep. Basically, actions that evoke emotions. It's almost an extreme of behavioral type of therapy, if you can call it that. So basically what he says here is that when a person will act in a joyous way, they begin to become a joyous way, even if they're not in the mood. Let's elaborate a bit on this. Let's explain what this means. If it's fake, then what are you doing? What's happening exactly? You're just hyping yourself up? You're like just forcing yourself to do something you're not? Clearly, it's a lot deeper than that. Let's talk about what joy is. What is simcha? So many people will, especially in our modern world where we see objects as being commodities, so we think just like you go to a store, you need a loaf of bread, you buy a loaf of bread. You press button A, B, C, D, you elicit joy. Joy as a commodity. Joy as, another way of putting it, as an action, as a verb. But what happens if joy is not, simcha is not a commodity? And it's not an action. Maybe it's a noun, it's a state of being. And therefore you find a completely different approach. If something is a commodity, you have to find where is it and how do I get there? If it's an action, you have to act that way until you and then you become that way. But if it's a state of being, which means it's a natural state of being, then you have to look at what can I do that will elicit that state of being. And that, in that context, joy is not something you can just purchase. You can't just press a button. Joy is a state of being of the natural relationship of the soul with God. And this, let's go back to Tanya. After the chapters that he discusses, the issue of atzvus, of depression, then he goes into the whole discussion of simcha. And to sum up the few key points that he gives advice there of how a person comes to joy. So first he says it's the joy when you recognize that we live in a dark world. He gives the example of a prince who was in prison and he gets out of prison. There's no greater joy than that. When a soul in a body suddenly is aware of itself, there's a great joy involved. Now, if you're living in a material world and you're expecting material things to give you joy, go back to the commodity, it's going to be short-lived. How long does money last? How long does honor, how long does power, influence last? That's as long as your joy will last, and then you'll need more. However, the connection of a person's soul to their divine mission is something that is forever. So the trap that we're in is we live in a material world and we want material joy, so we go to material things to achieve that joy. And that joy is an instant gratification, it's a candy, sugar-coated. The key is to access a natural joy that a soul has, but you can't access it as long as you are a materialistic person. You have to access it by seeing and transcending your material needs. So the first thing he says in Tanya, this is chapter 31, that the person has to think about the joy that comes from being freed from a prison. A transcendent experience, experiencing your soul, is a deep simcha. That's number one. And that takes work, but it takes a certain contemplation. Then he goes on and says, furthermore, there's another level of joy. Actually, from there he goes into the famous chapter Tanya 32 about Ahavas Yisrael, which is another discussion about the idea that the key to loving another person is the same key as having joy. His Gabrus Hatzur Alachem, the way he puts it there, that nefesh iker and gufei tafel. When your body is your primary force and your soul is secondary, you will not be that happy and you will not be that loving. When your soul is primary and the body is secondary, then you start opening up the channel for joy and for love. Then in chapter 33, and continues in 34, he goes into the discussion, the joy that you are part of destiny. You are part of fulfilling the purpose of existence. One of the Yud-based psukim that the Rebbe instituted, that Saz v'sameach, the joy that not only you have, he says, a joy kofel, like this month of Adar, a double Adar, joy, a double joy. Not only the joy you have of fulfilling the purpose, but the joy that you bring to God, because there's no greater joy to God in transforming the material into spiritual, making a dira b'tachtenim. Bottom line, all this, I know many people have learned this in Tanya. They say, oh, I've heard this. Let's apply it personally. That's the key. Think of it as a message to you personally. You went to the Alter Rebbe, you go into the Rebbe, they tell you want joy, you have to start doing things that are less materialistic. That's the Eitzah. Yes, there's no shortcuts. There's no way you can have your cake and eat it too. To say I'm going to get joy from my material things and that joy should be lasting, it'll not happen. So when someone says, how do I elicit joy? To sum up, first of all, behave that way. What means behave that way? Because the truth is that you have a soul, as I mentioned before, was sent to this earth on a mission. you're indispensable. What greater joy is there than that? The greatest joy possible on earth. Now you'll say, well, I'm not used to thinking like that. Okay, that's the reconditioning we need. That's why we're doing this. That's why we learn Tanya. That's why we learn Chassidus. To recondition. Who are you? When parents have great joy from their children, is this material joy? No, it's spiritual joy. It's connected to something more cosmic, more transcendent than immediate needs. Now, if we're trapped in immediate needs, then we go back to the taivas and to the addictions we've discussed. We have to get out of that. But the joy comes from recognizing that type of spiritual transcendence. That's what it comes down to. The Tzemach Tzedek adds that when you act that way, it actually starts affecting you. Not because you're superimposing some type of false persona. It's because you're eliciting the real you. But the only way to do it is to just behave that way. So sometimes you dress sometimes a person dresses, they're in a bad mood, they dress like they're in a bad mood. That just makes things worse. They look bad. Other people don't want to be near them. You act happy, people are drawn to you. And that, in a way, brings you happiness. Essentially, it comes down to being more of a giver than a taker. So coming the month of Adar, there's some of the methods that one can use. Yes, it comes down to ultimately elevating our beings to being a little more transcendent than we are. Transcendence is direct channel to true simcha. And as I said before, if anyone that focuses, I'm going to find joy today, will never find it. It's the people that dedicate their lives to things that are not about me, to helping another, to helping humanity, to giving. Those are the people, the result of that is joy. Think of it like Kesher Shem Tov Eila al Gubeim, the famous question. Shleish Ksarim, the Mishnah says, there are 3 crowns. Kesher Torah, Kesher Kahuna, Kesher Malchus. The crown of Torah, the crown of Kahuna and priesthood, and the crown of kingship. Then it says, and the Kesher of a good name, the crown of a good name, rises above them. So everyone asked the question, the Rebbe asked the question, why does it say 3 crowns? It should have said 4 crowns. The answer is because the 4th crown you cannot directly access. You have the other 3, you can learn Torah, you can be born a priest, you can be, you can become a king. So whether it's through Aveda, whether through Yerusha. But the 4th thing comes, you can't go buy a good name. No one can give it to you. You can't even inherit it. You do the right things, and this climbs on top of them all. It rises. It's what Chassidus speaks about, like the 50th day, Shavuos, after 49 days counting. Simcha is what happens. When you do the right things, then something emerges called joy. You can't get it. But we live in a commodity-based society, and people say, I want to buy it. I want to buy happiness. I want to buy love. These true things in life don't work that way. They come as a result of doing the right things. And these are some suggestions that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. He says clearly, eitzes of how to reach that state is about recognizing your own spirit and how it's a more dominant force. It frees itself from its dark place. And recognizing that you are chosen to fulfill a mission that only you and only you can accomplish. And that is ultimately the greatest blessing in life, that you matter because God put you here on this earth. There's much more to say about all this, and I will definitely discuss this in the continuing sessions as we continue next Sunday. This has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, Episode 5. I look forward to speak again next Sunday at 8 p.m. And please send in your questions to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. And you could submit any question anonymously, confidentially. And I look forward to the continuing journey. Thank you very much.